Hi everyone. Today I'm starting a weekly video called This Week in 18C, which will discuss and respond to some of the developments about the debate around changing Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act that have occurred the previous week. In this week's edition, I'll be responding to a speech given by Race Discrimination Commissioner Tim Soutphommasane, and I'll also be commenting on a poll that apparently purports to say that 75% of Australians support retaining Section 18C as it's currently written. So we begin with the dishonesty, authoritarianism and hysteria of Tim Soutphommasane. This week he gave a speech at the Adelaide Law School in which he argued for keeping 18C exactly how it is, with absolutely no changes at all. And part of his speech was published in the Huffington Post. This article is called "If We Relax the Racial Discrimination Act, We Risk Condoning Racism." It's from February 16, 2017. Here he goes. The law in Australia has never provided a perfect protection against racism. For a long time, the law was in fact silent about racism. Prior to the enactment of anti-discrimination laws, there was little that those on the receiving end of racial discrimination and hatred could do about their mistreatment. Now, obviously, he's right about that, and obviously it was wrong that that was the case. And I think at some point in time, we passed laws that properly dealt with that in a proportionate manner. And now I think we've gone beyond that to a disproportionate manner. It is true that a citizen subjected to racial discrimination or harassment could have turned to the criminal code or to civil actions. Yet in reality, this was cold comfort. In the absence of an actual physical assault or immediate specific threat, racial hatred was typically beyond the reach of the criminal law. As for the common law, the targets of racism had very few legal remedies available for interference with the person, reputation and property. Put another way, the law in Australia hasn't always dealt with the human costs of racism. For a long time, Australian society was very explicitly structured on notions of race. Colonial governments openly sanctioned discrimination on racial lines. Racial integrity was a defining aspiration of Australian nationhood, enshrined in legislation such as the Immigration Restriction Act and in practices of assimilation applied to Indigenous peoples. Obviously that was wrong too, and I'm glad that's no longer the case. But we did not need 18C to change that. 18C didn't come along until 1995, after which we had abolished the White Australia policy, after which we had abolished Section 127 from the Constitution, and Section 51, subsection 26 had been amended, so those sections did not discriminate against Aborigines. 18C does not apply to to combating the old type of racism that used to exist in this country. It wasn't until 1975 that the Commonwealth Parliament legislated to establish a protection against racial discrimination in the form of the RDA. The RDA introduced a new and humane quality to Australian law and society. It was an attempt to legislate for human dignity. To uphold human dignity is to believe that all humans have an intrinsic value, that every person, regardless of social rank or importance, is entitled to consideration. It is to accept that every human being should command respect, because we have a status as rational agents possessing the freedom to choose. There is, in this sense, an imperative to treat someone with dignity, to treat them with certain respect as a person. Now, obviously, it's a good thing that we moved away from when we weren't doing that and started doing that much better. And I do think the old type of racism needed laws to combat that and to do away with it. And so I think the original 1975 Racial Discrimination Act was a good step towards changing that. And I think, given what it did, its model of legislating for human dignity was proper. Here we go again. Racial prejudice and discrimination can have profound effects on a person, as with any prejudicial or discriminatory conduct based on attributes such as sex, disability, or sexual orientation. Now, it's interesting because sex, disability, and sexual orientation, there are no federal laws saying it's illegal to offend someone on the basis of their sex or disability status or sexual orientation. I don't hear the hysterical argument that the lack of these laws at a federal level is somehow allowing an imminent holocaust of women or LGBTI people or disabled people to brew, right? Because it isn't. That is not happening. So given that despite the lack of federal laws in those instances, there is not the trouble he's saying will happen if we weaken 18C, I'm not sure what makes racial offensive speech different such that it is going to breed a second Holocaust if we change 18C, but with no hate speech laws at all for these categories, everything's fine. I'm not sure why race is different. It may, he goes again, it may involve not just a lack of due respect, it may inflict more grievous wounds. There has been extensive debate about Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act, which makes it unlawful to do an act that offends, insults, humiliates, or intimidates someone because of their race. Since the federal court's judgment in the Eatock v. Bolt case 2011, which found newspaper columnist Andrew Bolt to have breached the Racial Discrimination Act, there have been regular calls for repeal or amendment of Section 18C. In 2014, the federal government attempted to repeal Section 18C following an election pledge to do so. The proposed legislative change was abandoned after widespread public opposition to the government's proposal. One Fairfax poll in March 2014 found that 88% of people agree that it should remain unlawful to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate someone because of their race. Now, this is really clever because he's brought in two completely irrelevant facts into the current debate we're having about 18C and trying to pass them off as if they matter now. First of all, that poll in March 2014 was 3 years ago. Since then, there's been the QUT case and the absurdity of being dragged to federal court because you said computer labs shouldn't be segregated by race. The Bill Leak complaint, where he drew an offensive cartoon about Aboriginal parenting, and there was a complaint to the Human Rights Commission over that. And also the Japanese group complaining about the Korean War Memorial, a war memorial about the massacres done to Koreans and Chinese people in the rape of Nanking, because it's offensive to Japanese people now. These absurd cases have undoubtedly shifted people's attitudes on 18C, and we've seen that reflected in more recent polls that find a plurality of people support at least removing the words offend and insult from the Act. That's the first thing that's irrelevant that is brought in. The second thing is the government's proposal to change 18C in the first half of 2014 went far, far beyond what the current proposal to change it is. At the moment, we only are thinking about removing the words offend and insult. Back then, the government wanted to repeal the whole Act entirely and make it illegal only to incite hatred against people or intimidate people. But for both of those things, there would be a free speech exemption that would exempt pretty much anything. Now, I actually opposed that proposal back then because I thought it was allowing too much and would basically allow incitement to violence that could then, and that incitement would be legal under the free speech exemption. So I didn't support it, but that's not what we're talking about now. So we shouldn't use people's opposition to that proposal as somehow informative of their position on this much, much more modest proposal to amend the Act only slightly. Other research has indicated strong majority support for the retention of the current section, not in its current form. I will bring you. I'll show you the polls here in the description section of this video that you can check out to prove that a plurality of Australians do support amending the Act. More recently, numerous parliamentarians have advocated the deletion of offend and insult from Section 18C. Advocates of legislative change argue that the current provision places an unreasonable limitation on freedom of speech. The Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights is currently considering the operation of the RDA and the complaints handling processes of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Much of the criticism of the RDA has been misplaced or misguided. Many critics have ignored how Section 18C is accompanied by Section 18D, which protects any fair comment or reporting on a matter of public interest and any sentiment expressed in the course of any statement, publication, discussion or debate made or held for any genuine academic, artistic or scientific purpose. provided something is done reasonably and in good faith, take note of that, any fair comment or public discussion will be exempt from being in breach of Section 18C. So the part about something being done reasonably and in good faith sounds reasonable and not too high a bar to meet. That's not true at all. In the Andrew Bolt case, the judge in that case found that Bolt had breached the breached 18C and was not eligible for an exemption under Section 18D, not just because he got his facts wrong, as 18C's defenders have often said. It was not only for that reason. The judge also found that he couldn't have an 18D exemption because he used, quote, inflammatory and provocative language, unquote. In other words, if your tone is too harsh, your adjectives too sharp, and I'm paraphrasing what Andrew Bolt actually wrote after this finding here, words too sharp, adjectives too harsh, tone too harsh, your wit too sharp, your humour too funny, then it will be ruled to be not reasonable and not in good faith, and it'll be illegal. So essentially, a judge is deciding whether or not your tone is such that what you said should not be made illegal. That is not how free speech works at all. He continues, throughout my time as Race Discrimination Commissioner, I have consistently said there is no persuasive case for changing Section 18C. The RDA should remain in its current form. As they stand, Sections 18C and 18D strike an appropriate balance between freedom from racial vilification and freedom of speech. Now, I want to know exactly what is meant by freedom from racial vilification here. So I'll explain what I mean by this by explaining what I would do to Section 18C. I would repeal the Act in its entirety and substitute in explicit prohibitions on the following things. Advocating or encouraging violence on the grounds of race, and probably on any grounds, making specific threats, and personally abusing or vilifying a person face-to-face, right? And the reason I'd make these changes is because inciting violence could lead to violence objectively and obviously, and that's not something the society can tolerate and has to make sure it doesn't get to that point. I certainly agree with that. And threats is the same thing applies to threats. As for abuse, it is objectively physically intimidating to be standing next to someone and abusing them because of their race. That creates an objective sense of danger that people should be freed from. And that's not about what you're saying. It's not a freedom of speech issue because it's not what you're saying that is why it's illegal. It's because you are putting them in an objective sense of danger. Now, I think you should absolutely be free from having violence incited against you, and you should be free from that danger. And that freedom should be enshrined in law. However, for other forms of racial vilification, I completely agree that any form of racial vilification is vile and morally reprehensible. But you don't need the law to be free from it. Because if someone, for example, writes a racist article in a newspaper, or writes a racist letter to the editor, or draws an offensive cartoon, you can be free from that without the law. You don't have to read it. You don't have to look at the cartoon. You don't have to buy the newspaper, right? You can free yourself from that offensive vilification simply by not involving yourself in it. You don't need the law to do that for you. Now, that's a different... the reason you don't need the law to be free from it in that case, but you do in the personal abuse instance, is because you are a captive audience if you are being personally vilified. You've made no choice to look into that newspaper. You've made no choice to be vilified. You've had no say in the matter as to whether or not that's going to happen to you. You've been forced into it, and you shouldn't be forced into it against your consent. So that's why law is needed to enshrine that freedom from racial vilification when it's personally abusive. But when it's just something offensive, that something's written that you don't have to look at, you don't need the law to be free from it. Here we go. It is important that Australian society sends a strong message that racial vilification can be held to account while guaranteeing freedom of speech. And here's the problem. Laws can never be justified just by saying they are there to send a strong message. And the reason this is the case is because if it is sufficient justification for a law that makes certain conduct illegal, then you can justify anything, passing any prohibition on anything. For example, we could bring back the Leviticus law that says insolent children should be executed. Now, that's ridiculously disproportionate and barbaric, but hey, it sends a strong message, so it's fine. No, it's not fine. You need a better reason to have a law than to send a strong message, because when all you need is a strong message, you establish the principle that we can ban anything just for the purpose of sending a message. You can send a message without banning something. Right? I think we do have a good anti-racist culture in Australia. I do think most people are appalled by racism. We're going to get into that more often. We don't need laws to be sending a message that racism is wrong. This has been a concern, he continues, this has been a concern also expressed by many who have made submissions to the current parliamentary inquiry. Of the 370 or so unique submissions made to the inquiry, a majority have been in favour of retaining the current wording of the RDA. Among the communities whose members are most susceptible to experiencing racism, Indigenous communities and multicultural communities across the country, the view has been unanimous, at least among representative community bodies, that the RDA must continue to send an unambiguous signal. Now, obviously, of course, the opinion of someone in an ethnic minority does not matter less than someone who's not an ethnic minority, right? Their opinion matters as much as everyone else. Of course it does. But it doesn't matter more. It also doesn't matter less, but it doesn't matter more. We cannot be deferring to ethnic minorities to have the final say on a law that affects everyone, because the Racial Discrimination Act does affect everyone. 18C bans all, regulates all of our conduct, bans all speech that anyone could make. It's not just a matter for ethnic minorities, it's a matter for everyone. He continues, racism should never be condoned or tolerated. If Section 18C were to be watered down, if some words of the section were to be deleted, or if the bar to racial vilification were to be raised, that is precisely the risk our society would run. So he is against any kind of change at all, no matter how minute or negligible. He is against any kind of change at all. What kind of society must we already be living in if simply removing 2 words from the act, offend and insult, is just going to unleash this homicidally dangerous tsunami of racism? Right? 18C clearly has not done a very good job at making us not racist if that's the case, in which case, that people should stop defending it. But this is the other thing I wanted to get to about this comment. Racism should never be condoned or tolerated, and we risk condoning or tolerating that if we water it down. Now, this is really, really idiotic, because he's saying that if something shouldn't be condoned, the only way to not condone it is to make it illegal. He is establishing the principle that we should ban things that we do not condone. And we all have different ideas about what we shouldn't condone. Now, if according to him, that leaves us with the only option to ban it, then we can make the case for banning anything. And other people can try to ban what he likes, right? And subject him to authoritarianism over something they personally disapprove of. Now racism should definitely be disapproved of, but the principle is consistent nonetheless. If condoning something requires banning it, then you can ban anything you don't condone. So, for example, conservative Christians who oppose gay marriage now have a justification under Soutphommasane's own logic, and I'm sure he supports gay marriage, to say, we don't condone this, therefore we should ban it. No, it is entirely possible to not condone something without banning it, right? For example, Parliament could pass a motion condemning what would be legal if the Racial Discrimination Act is changed, so they make it legal while still maintaining disapproval of it, right? You don't need to ban something to not condone it. He continues, this risk is underlined by recent surveys which indicate experiences of racial discrimination may be on the rise. The Scanlon Foundation's National Social Cohesion Survey found that the reported experience of discrimination among respondents rose from 15% in 2015 to 20% in 2016, which is the highest level for a decade. Now, 20% of Australians who experience racism is obviously 20% too high, but at the same time, it's not that many, is it? Right? Like, the vast majority do not experience it. I don't think it's as serious a problem as he makes it out to be. And also, if racist incidents are increasing under Section 18C, then I would say that it's not doing its job, because it's apparently meant to prevent this. And so if it's not doing its job to begin with, well, what more is going to happen if we repeal 18C than if we don't? If it's effective to begin with, nothing more is going to happen by changing it. Reconciliation Australia's survey research has also found that almost half, 46%, of the Aboriginal population has described experiencing racism during the past 6 months, up from 39% in 2014. Now that I'm really saddened by that, because that's an absurdly high number, 46% of Aboriginals experiencing racism. But again, like, would that number be even higher if 18C was not on the books? Do you think the people who give them that terrible racism give a hoot about 18C? Right? It can be resolved in a mediation session in the Human Rights Commission. Do you think they're afraid of that? Do you think that will deter them? The people who do this do not care about the penalties for breaching it. The only way to make them care would be to apply ridiculous, disproportionate penalties for it, which we can't do, which would make matters even worse. Here we go. He continues. At a time when racist and nationalist elements of the community are being emboldened, when it is clear that experiences of racial discrimination have been on the rise, our Parliament should consider, does it really want to signal that it may be easier to say things that are racially harmful? Now, I would also like to know what he means by racially harmful. Does he mean a legitimate opinion that someone may find offensive because of their race, or does he mean actual, genuine racism on the basis of someone's race? Because that's vaguely defined. I don't know what racially harmful means. Is it harmful in the sense of the person doing it, or is it harmful in the sense of someone else perceiving it as something? Because we can't be making things illegal based on subjective perceptions and interpretations of them. And also be wary of this rhetorical trick he uses. Does he want it to? Does Parliament wish to signal that it may be easier to say things that are racially harmful? Now, technically that is true. It would be easier to say something that is racially harmful, but only slightly, and it would still remain difficult to say such things because we do have a climate of anti-racism in Australia, as I'll elaborate on my next part of this video. It's still going to be difficult, right? And so the more accurate way, the way that is not misleading to look at it, would be, do we want to make it slightly less difficult to say racially harmful things? I say yes. We should make it less difficult than it is now to say racially harmful things. And even if we acknowledge, and I do, that there are certain things that are racist and vile, right? Even when there are wrong things that should be dealt with, it is still possible, even when it's a bad thing, to respond to it disproportionately. And that is not just. The punishment should fit the crime, and the punishment for saying something offensive should not be a breach of the law. So all we are doing is making it slightly less difficult than you have breached the law and can be dragged through the courts if you say something offensive, right? There will still be the social disapproval of it. There will still be the personal consequences of it. But one real weapon that can be used to punish these people will be gone, right? It's not going to suddenly be, everyone's going to be free and feel emboldened and have no problem saying whatever they want now. That climate is not going to go away. Does Parliament wish to say that people will be able to exercise racial vilification as an expression of free speech? Now, again, freedom of speech means you can say what you want. Therefore, if what you want to say is racist, then freedom of speech requires that you be able to say it. Like, to a lot of people, that idea is going to be really confronting. And they're going to say, wait, what? You seriously think freedom of speech means you can say racist things? Yes, it does. It's vile, but we have to be consistent. The principle of freedom of speech doesn't mean anything if we just suddenly abandon it once it becomes difficult to uphold, because it is by protecting the free speech rights of others that we preserve our own free speech rights. So if we start saying this is offensive, this should be illegal, well, other people who find other things offensive can do the same thing and can make what we would like to say illegal, right? You know, I'm sure there are some very conservative Christians who would have what I've said about Christianity and religion made illegal under blasphemy law, right? You know, but they have not been consistent on free speech, but their view is legitimised by the attitude that offensive speech should be illegal. Does Parliament wish to say that a right to vent racial sentiments must outweigh a right to be free from racism? Is this the kind of society we want to become? I'll just remind you of my previous point on this. Yes, you should be legally free from violence and violent threats and personal face-to-face abuse. And the law is necessary to establish your freedom from those things. But the law is not necessary to establish your freedom from offensive comments in a newspaper or on someone's blog or in a cartoon, because all you have to do is not read it. And so that's the article. I'll go back to some other things, go back to some things he said that I would like to reiterate and make extra commentary on. One of the comments he makes is about when he's talking about the harm of racism. Let me find it. Here we go. He says this: racial prejudice and discrimination can have profound effects on a person. It may not involve just lack of due respect. It may inflict more grievous wounds. Now, you know, obviously it's certainly unpleasant and bad when someone encounters racism. But if the government is saying that that we are going to step in and make this illegal, make this racist expression illegal, it is sending the message that it is an extremely serious matter. Because in liberal democracies, governments only intervene and step in on social issues, on issues that would otherwise be personal, when they're extremely serious and need the government's intervention. So if it's intervening on racist speech, then it is saying it is that serious. And therefore, it is not surprising that some people will end up believing that it is serious as the government is telling them, and therefore they may come to believe that something really, really bad has happened to them that has not actually happened to them, and they may feel more oppressed and more victimized than they otherwise would have felt had it not been for the government saying, what's happened is really bad. On the other hand, if the message being sent by the government was, yes, that's wrong, that's not nice, however, it is not so bad it warrants us getting involved with the law, then I think people would be more likely to go, yes, I don't like it, it's annoying, but it's not so serious, it's oppressing me or victimizing me. So I think that not sending the message that something is worse than it is necessary in allowing people to establish a personal resistance and immunity, to a certain degree, of course, to harms of racism that otherwise are inflicted when they believe it's worse than it is. And finally, I'll say something about the argument that if we change 18C, it's going to lead to more racist expressions. It is perfectly possible that if we remove the words offend and insult, that it will lead to more people saying offensive and insulting things. However, that's not an argument for not removing those words, because I think people should be allowed to say them. I don't think it's good that they say them, but if people are allowed to say them after changing it and they weren't allowed to say them before, I think that's a good thing. Now again, that's going to be uncomfortable to a lot of people. Hang on, you think it's a good thing people are allowed to say racist things? Yes, I do. Not that it's a good thing that they say them, but it is a good thing that they be allowed to say them. And so, Tim Soutphommasane talked about sending a strong message. Under my model of what I would do with 18C and racial vilification laws, the strong message would still be being sent by the law for what I think should be illegal: incitement to violence, violent threats, and personal face-to-face abuse. The law will still be sending the message on those things. So there will be no greater a feeling of empowerment among racists that they can do those specific things, threats and abuse, if my model is implemented. If they do feel empowered to say offensive and insulting things, it's bad that they say them, but I think they should be allowed to say them, so it's not bad So it's not a reason to not change the law that they would feel empowered to say offensive and insulting things. So now I'm going to move on to the poll that apparently found that 75% of Australians support retaining Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act as it's currently written. The poll is reported on in an article in The Conversation from February 17, 2017, titled, Australians believe 18C protections should stay. Protections. They're not shields, they're swords. It starts. While debate over the merits of Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act continues to rage, new research shows that an overwhelming majority of Australians support legislation that prevents insults on the basis of race, culture, or religion. We found that just 10% of Australians believe people should have the freedom to insult and offend people on the basis of race, culture, or religion. Over 75% are opposed. The poll, conducted by Essential Research for the Cyber Racism and Community Resilience and our other challenging racism research projects, undermines other claims that nearly 50% of Australians want the key words removed from Section 18C. Now, when I first read this poll, I thought, oh, come on, what, really? Are Australians really that stupid that they think it should be illegal to offend not just on the basis of race, but on the basis of religion? That is not the case at all. I'm going to read out to you the wording of the poll. This is what the poll asked. People should, so it asked for for two different words. It asked for offend and insult, which are the two words being considered for removal from the Act. People should be free to offend someone on the basis of their race, culture, or religion. Agree or disagree. Disagree, 79.2%. Agree, 9.7%. Neither agree nor disagree, 11.1%. And next, people should be free to insult someone on the basis of their race, culture, or religion. Disagree, 82.4%. Neither agree nor disagree, 9.5%. Agree, 8.1%. Now, what it says again. People should be free to offend/insult someone on the basis of race, culture, or religion. There is absolutely no mention, zero, of illegality here. It does not talk about it being illegal. What does free mean? Does it mean legally free? It doesn't say that. I'm sure a lot of people took this to mean socially free. Like, should there be no social discouragement and disapproval and deterrence from offending people on the basis of their race? We'll stick to race because that's what it's about. And of course, the vast majority of Australians are going to agree with that, that there should be social deterrence. And that's what I was saying before when I said that there is a climate of anti-racism in Australia such that we don't need laws to send the signal that racism is not okay. Right, so this poll is useless. It is worthless in trying to gauge people's views on 18C because it does not talk about illegality, which is crucial. Now I'm going to respond to their commentary on this poll in other parts of this article. The first thing I'll respond to is this. They say, only 5 to 10% of Australians support the right to offend on the basis of race, culture, or religion. Those who are younger and males are more likely to support these freedoms. I think there is a more libertarian streak among young men that leads them to want to be able to do certain things, want to basically have fun, have a good time, that leads them to be more supportive of libertarian attitudes that then flows into freedom of speech that other demographics are less likely to have overall. Next part. They say, in our other surveys over the past decade, we have found that about the same proportion of Australians, 1 in 10, hold negative views about diversity and races. For example, around 10 to 12% believe some races are superior to others and that groups should not intermarry. These are indicators of racial supremacism and racial separatism. Now, obviously, that's genuine racism, and obviously, those ideas are terrible. But I do think it's quite informative, as they also acknowledge that a similar proportion of people who said into this poll it's okay to offend and insult people on the basis of race said that some races are superior to others and so forth. I think that shows that only people who are genuinely racist, really virulently racist, said yes to that question, and that therefore they are the only ones who think that it's okay, not just legally okay, but morally and socially, or should be morally and socially okay to be racist. So that I think is evidence that the only people who said yes to that poll thought that it was talking about also social acceptability of racism, and therefore people who said no, they shouldn't be free to say that, I think also thought it was talking about social acceptability. And of course, most Australians don't think it's socially acceptable to be racist, even if they do think racist comments should be legal. Next part. There may well be those who support these freedoms from a Voltaire-inspired conviction about the right to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate. The ridicule of that sentiment that I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, is troubling. However, analysis of the 2014 CRACR survey data has found statistical associations between authors of online racism, racist dispositions, and a preference for the freedom to offend. Authors of racism with racist views most want the right to be racist. Well, of course they do, because it affects them the most. 18C is going to catch people who say racist things before it's going to catch other people. But also, what a stupid argument to make that basically changing 18C is wrong because racists want to change it. So if some people with bad ideas support a policy proposal, that automatically makes it wrong. So to this author of this article, did you stop supporting gay marriage when those violent threats were made to the Mercure Hotel? Because some gay marriage supporters are idiots, therefore it's the wrong policy. Really? No, that's a stupid way to think. Next, the political implications are also of interest. Focusing just on offend and insult, the spread confirms that the left of the political spectrum is more opposed to licensing hate than the right. Well, given the riots at UC Berkeley over Milo Yiannopoulos, I would question that the left is less hateful than the right now. But also, the way they phrase what changing 18C will do, they say it is licensing hate. It's not licensing hate. License is explicit permission to do something. You can't drive until you have a driver's license. You can't drive until you have that explicit permission to drive. I would be opposed to a law that explicitly said it is okay to be racist. That would be licensed to be racist. I'm against that. I just don't think there should be laws that say it is illegal to be racist. That is reluctantly tolerating something that should be tolerated even though it's offensive and wrong. Right? That is not licensed to do it. Support for the freedom to offend ranges from 7% ALP and Greens to 11% LNP. Okay, so here's the thing. 11% of coalition voters said that people should be free to offend on the basis of race. Now, do you really think 11% of coalition voters, just 11%, are in favour of changing Section 18C? It's much, much higher than that. They said that they did not think Australians should be free to insult and offend on the basis of race because they didn't think it was applying only to legally free. They recognise that this question also implies socially free because free just means freedom generally. And, social pressure and disapproval of racist comments is still, a deterrent from doing it. So it's not complete freedom, is it? And up to 16% not wanting to, thinking it shouldn't be legal to offend, thinking they shouldn't be free to offend with others and independents. Opposition to the freedom to offend peaks with the Greens 86%, but still sits at 70% for independents. Support for the freedom to insult ranges from 5% ALP and 8% Greens. Okay, again, do you think Greens voters are more likely to support changing 18C than the ALP? Of course not, right? So this data does not speak to legality. To 12% LNP and up to 13% with others and independents. Opposition for the freedom to insult peaks with the Greens, 88%, but still sits at 72% for independents. This evidence suggests that over the past 3 years, despite incessant campaigning by pro-vilification proponents, Australians' appetite for the right to be bigots has declined. Yes, if you think something shouldn't be banned, you are automatically in favour of that thing. If you think it shouldn't be illegal to say a racist comment, then you are pro-racism. This is a stupid and disgraceful and dishonest tactic from whoever's written this article. So I'd say to them, are you pro everything that you think should not be banned? I'll use the insolent children example from earlier. Do you think it should be illegal, punishable by law for children to be rude to their parents? No? You don't think that? Okay, then you must think that's a good thing. That's absurd, right? And, it's I'm surprised to be reading this surprised to be reading this opinion and this argument so unapologetically. Like, isn't it obvious what's wrong with it? The impression we gain is that civility remains a high value. Whatever people's valuing of freedom of speech, which is very high, no, it's not. Not if you think it should be illegal to offend people. They do not think that such a freedom should encompass the insulting and offending of people on the basis of race, culture, and religion. And this is the trick where you try to have it both ways. What they're doing here is saying, no, we do believe in freedom of speech. All we're saying is that freedom of speech does not include the freedom to offend on the basis of race. And because it doesn't include that, we can support banning that while still being in favour of freedom of speech. No. As I said before, the moral principle behind freedom of speech is that it is by securing the free speech rights of others that we secure them for ourselves, because we establish a consistent principle that just because something is offensive, it shouldn't be banned. Therefore, we establish that when we offend other people, they do not have the authority to ban what we said because they find it offensive, right? When you say, no, freedom of speech does not mean the right to offend, you are not distinguishing between two separate principles and saying, okay, we've got two principles, we've got freedom of speech and not freedom to offend, and those are different. You're not doing that. What you are doing is carving an arbitrary exemption out of one principle and then calling that exemption another principle because it suits what you want to do. Right? This is not based on any sound logical argument about why freedom of speech and freedom to offend are actually different. It's based on, we don't like freedom to offend, therefore we're going to arrogate to ourselves the authority to say that it is not included in the right to freedom of speech, and then unilaterally redefine freedom of speech for our own purposes. This is extremely disingenuous, and it is a terrible way to approach liberty if you want to live in a free society. Final paragraph. Moreover, this trend reverberates with the finding of another essential poll in late 2016, where Australians are worried that insulting people on the basis of race and religion is rising. Now it's over to the committee, parliament, and the people. Okay, so if they're worried that insulting people on the basis of race and religion is rising, but as the polls I'm going to show you in the description of this video show, they're still in favour of changing 18C. That shows they recognise, more Australians than not recognise we can be worried about something that's wrong increasing while still being against banning that. That's what that polling data shows. Just because they're worried about it increasing doesn't mean they think it should be banned, right? This is a concept that far, far too few supporters of 18C are grasping right now. In the description, I'll include a link to an article discussing Gillian Triggs' testimony before the Parliamentary Committee investigating changes to Section 18C, but I'm not going to comment on it here because her testimony is more about the process of the Human Rights Commission. So thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed it.